They thought I'd just go along with their plan, like I always did. But this time, I had a secret that left them in shock. I should have seen it coming. I should have known the moment my mother called and invited me to dinner. "It's been too long," she said sweetly. "The whole family will be there." Her voice was too smooth, too careful. I felt my stomach twist. Something wasn't right. But like an idiot, I went anyway. The restaurant was nice. Too nice. My parents never splurged like this unless they wanted something. I sat down, glanced around the table. My sister smirked at me, looking way too pleased with herself. I barely had time to pick up my menu before my father cleared his throat. "So," he started casually, "we've been talking, and we think it's best if your sister moves in with you." Just like that. No discussion. No warning. Not, "Would you be okay with this?" Not, "Do you have space?" Just a decision they had already made for me. Like I had no say in my own life. I set my menu down, heartbeat steady. I didn't react. Didn't argue. Didn't even blink. I just let them talk. Because I already knew something they didn't. And by the time they found out, it would be too late. They kept going, acting like this was some normal conversation. My sister just nodding along, completely unbothered. "It makes the most sense," my mother said, sipping her wine. "She needs a fresh start, and you have the space." Lies. Every word. They didn't care about what made the most sense. They just didn't want her living with them. They wanted me to deal with her. To be responsible for her problems. To clean up their mess. Like I always had. I glanced at my sister. She wasn't even pretending to be grateful. She was smug. Because she thought this was already decided. Like she was entitled to my space. My home. My life. Like I didn't matter. Like I never had. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. I could feel my parents waiting for me to just nod and accept it. To say, "Of course. Whatever you need." To let them win. But I wasn't that person anymore. And in less than 24 hours, they were about to realize just how little control they had left over me. I let them talk. Let them ramble on about how this was the best solution for everyone. How my sister deserved a fresh start. How I was the responsible one, so of course, it made sense for me to take care of her. Like I was some safety net they could throw their problems onto whenever they wanted. Like I hadn't spent my whole life being the afterthought. Like my choices, my space, my life didn't matter. I didn't argue. Didn't push back. I just sat there, nodding along. Because the truth? I was already 3 steps ahead of them. My mother smiled, clearly thinking I was on board. "Good," she said, pleased. "We'll have her things packed by the weekend." Weekend. That's when it hit me. They weren't asking me to take her in. They were telling me. This wasn't a conversation. It was a decision they had already made. Without me. Because in their eyes, my life still belonged to them. But here's what they didn't know. While they were making their plans, I had already made mine. While they were assuming I'd just go along with it, I had already shut that door forever. Because my lease? The apartment they thought I was still living in? It had ended 2 weeks ago. And my new place? They didn't even know it existed. I almost laughed at the irony. They were sitting there, so confident, planning out my life like they always had. But the truth? I was already gone. They just didn't know it yet. And when they finally figured it out, they were in for a shock. I left the dinner without saying much. No arguments. No complaints. Just a polite nod, a small smile, exactly what they expected from me. They thought they had won. That they had neatly slotted me back into my role. The responsible one. The obedient one. The one who never said no. But what they didn't know, they had already lost. I walked back to my car, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. They thought my sister would be moving in by the weekend. That she'd have a nice, cozy place waiting for her. That I'd be there, waiting too. But they had no idea. Because by the weekend, I'd be long gone. The second I got home, I locked the door behind me and took a deep breath. Boxes were already packed. Furniture already sold. The last few things I owned were stacked neatly by the door, ready to be loaded into my car. Everything had gone exactly as planned. Because while they had spent the last few weeks planning my future, I had been planning my escape. I checked my phone. A message from my landlord. Final inspection tomorrow. Let me know if you need anything before you go. I smirked. Tomorrow. That was it. Less than 24 hours, and this chapter of my life would be over. And when my parents showed up on the weekend with my sister and her boxes, they'd find nothing but an empty apartment. No explanation. No goodbye. Just the cold realization that they had never actually controlled me at all. I could already imagine their faces. The confusion. The shock. My mother calling, demanding answers. My father furious that I had disrespected their plans. My sister, well, I wasn't sure she'd care. She had never seen me as a person, just a resource. A convenience. But now? Now they'd all have to face the truth. I wasn't their convenience anymore. I wasn't their problem solver. I wasn't the person they could control. I was free, and there was nothing they could do about it. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter than I had in years. This was it. The final day. By tonight, I'd be out of this apartment, out of their reach, completely gone from their plans. And they still had no idea. They were probably so sure of themselves. Still sitting around, talking about how everything is settled and how it's all for the best. Planning a future for me that didn't exist. By the time they realized, it would be too late. I started loading the last boxes into my car. No hesitation. No second guessing. This wasn't just about moving. This was about walking away from a life I never wanted. The life they had forced on me. I had spent years feeling like I was trapped. Like I had no say. Like no matter what I wanted, they would always decide for me. But today, I was finally choosing for myself. And my choice? To disappear from their world, just like they had expected me to clean up their messes without question. By noon, the apartment was empty. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking around one last time. It didn't feel like home. It never had. It was just a place I existed in. A place where they expected me to stay, waiting for them to need me again. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I grabbed my keys, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. No note. No explanation. Because they didn't deserve one. As I drove to my new apartment, the one they knew nothing about, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. We're coming over Saturday afternoon. Your sister is excited to move in. I almost laughed. They still didn't get it. They still thought they were in control. Still thought I was sitting there, waiting for their instructions. They had no idea they were about to walk into an empty apartment. No idea that I was already gone. And when Saturday came, they were in for the biggest shock of their lives. Saturday. The day they thought they had everything under control. The day they were supposed to show up with my sister's bags, ready to dump their problem on me and walk away like it was nothing. But what they didn't know, by the time they arrived, I was already gone. I sat in my new apartment, miles away from my old life, sipping coffee as my phone started blowing up. First, my mother. Then my father. Then my sister. One call after another. Each one going straight to voicemail. Because I wasn't answering. I was letting them figure it out on their own. I could picture it perfectly. Them pulling up to the old apartment, my sister complaining about how much stuff she had to carry. My mother checking her watch, wondering why I hadn't come outside to help. My father already annoyed, thinking I was being difficult for not waiting at the door like a good little servant. And then, the moment they walked inside, the moment they realized the apartment was empty. No furniture. No boxes. No me. Just cold, bare walls and silence. The first text came 5 minutes later. My mother. Where are you? I didn't respond. A second text. My father. What is this? Where's your stuff? Still nothing. Then, my sister. Are you kidding me? That one made me laugh. Because for the first time in my life, I was the one surprising them. They had spent years treating me like a backup plan. Like my life wasn't my own. Like I was just a tool to be used whenever they needed. But today? Today they realized the truth. I was done. And there was nothing they could do about it. The messages kept coming. One after another. My mother. This isn't funny. Where are you? My father. Call me. Now. My sister. Are you seriously doing this to me? I let the phone buzz. Watched as their panic grew. Because for the first time ever, they had no control over me. And they were finally starting to realize it. I imagined them standing in the empty apartment. My mother pacing, trying to come up with an excuse. My father furious, demanding answers. My sister? Probably just angry that her free ride had disappeared. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? This was never about family. It was about convenience. They never asked if I wanted her to move in. They never cared how I felt. They just assumed I'd do whatever they wanted. But now, they were standing there, realizing that for the first time in their lives, I had made a choice without them, and they couldn't handle it. I scrolled through the messages, the guilt trips, the demands, the sheer audacity. Then finally, one message that made me stop. My mother, if you don't come back, don't expect to be part of this family anymore. I left. Because that's what it all came down to, wasn't it? Control. Obedience. They had never treated me like family. I was just a piece on their chessboard, a tool they could move whenever they wanted. But now I was off the board, and they had no idea what to do. I took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, I felt weightless. No obligations. No expectations. Just freedom. And as I blocked their numbers, one by one, I realized I wasn't losing a family. I was finally escaping one. Silence. That's what I gave them. No responses. No explanations. Just silence. And it drove them insane. Because for the first time, they weren't the ones in control. And they couldn't stand it. A few days passed. The messages slowed down. First, my father stopped texting. Then my sister. Only my mother kept trying. Like she still believed she could fix this. Like she still thought I would come crawling back if she just said the right thing. Her messages started off angry. You need to come home and explain yourself. This is ridiculous. Stop acting like a child. Then, when I didn't respond, they turned desperate. I don't understand why you're doing this. We're still your family. Can't we talk? I almost laughed. Now they wanted to talk? After making decisions for me my entire life? After treating me like I existed only to serve them? Now they wanted my opinion? Too late. Way too late. A week passed. Then two. I moved on with my life. New apartment. New routine. For the first time, I was living for myself. Not for them. Not for their expectations. Not to be the responsible one while they treated me like I was nothing. And you know what? It felt incredible. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. A knock at my door. I froze. No one knew where I lived. At least, no one who was supposed to. I walked to the peephole and looked out. And my stomach dropped. Standing there, looking nervous, was my mother. They had found me. And I had no idea what they were about to say. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring through the peephole, watching as my mother shifted uncomfortably. She looked different. Less put together. Like for the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. And I liked that. She knocked again. I know you're in there. Her voice was soft. Careful. Not demanding like before. Not angry. But I wasn't stupid. This wasn't about me. This was about her. Her image. Her control. Her need to make sure I wasn't really gone. Because that's what scared her the most. That for the first time in my life, I didn't need her. I leaned against the door, listening. We just want to talk. So she wasn't alone. I glanced through the peephole again. Sure enough, my father was standing by the car, arms crossed. Waiting. Watching. My sister wasn't there. Not surprising. She probably didn't care enough to come. Or maybe she was just angry that her free ride was gone. Either way, it didn't matter. I wasn't opening the door. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, footsteps, moving away. I waited, heart pounding. Then my phone buzzed. A message. From my mother. We're not leaving until you talk to us. I exhaled, shaking my head. Of course. They weren't here to listen. They were here to pull me back in. But they didn't realize. I wasn't their prisoner anymore. And this time, I wasn't playing their game. They weren't going anywhere. I could feel it. That same stubborn control they had always clung to. For years, they dictated my life, where I lived, what I did, how much of their mess I was supposed to clean up. And now? Now they were standing outside my door, refusing to accept that they had lost. I stayed quiet. No response. No movement. Just waited. But they weren't backing down. A second knock. Louder. Then my father's voice, sharp and impatient. Enough of this. Open the door. I stared at the handle, my jaw clenched. That tone. The same one he always used when he expected obedience. Like I was some child, throwing a tantrum. Like I wasn't a grown adult who had made a choice. A choice they couldn't undo. Another message came through. This time from my father. You're embarrassing yourself. Just let us in. Embarrassing myself. That's what they thought this was? Not me setting boundaries. Not me reclaiming my life. Just me being difficult. Like my entire existence was supposed to revolve around making things easy for them. And when I finally stepped away, when I finally chose myself, it wasn't a decision. It was an inconvenience. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I stayed inside, calm, steady, waiting. They weren't used to this, me ignoring them. Me having control. And eventually, they cracked. Another message. This time, from my mother. We're leaving. But just know, you're making a huge mistake. I almost laughed. A mistake? Walking away from a life where I was nothing but their backup plan? No. The only mistake would have been letting them back in. So I didn't reply. Didn't watch them leave. I just turned off my phone, took a deep breath, and finally felt free. They left. Or at least, that's what they wanted me to believe. Because when I checked my phone the next morning, the messages were still coming. My mother. You're being cruel. My father. We did everything for you. My sister, finally deciding to chime in. Grow up. You think this makes you special? I stared at the screen, feeling nothing. No guilt. No regret. Just peace. Because they didn't understand. They never would. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about teaching them a lesson. This was about finally choosing myself. And they couldn't handle it. A few weeks passed. The calls stopped. The messages slowed. Then one day, silence. And I knew. They had finally accepted it. That I was gone. That they couldn't control me anymore. That for the first time ever, they had to live in a world where I wasn't at their beck and call. And that was their real punishment. Not some dramatic confrontation. Not some grand revenge. Just the quiet, empty reality they had created for themselves. I moved forward. A new job. New friends. A life that was fully mine. And them? They faded into the background. No longer a weight on my shoulders. No longer voices in my head. Just a past that I no longer carried. And the best part? They knew it. They knew they had lost me. For good. And now? They were the ones who had to live with it.